Welcome to Cure America. I'm Star Parker. The Trump administration recently rescinded an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule called AFFH. That rule was adopted in the early months of the Obama administration. The AFFH rule was an add-on to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was a federal response to the civil rights movement to stop discrimination in the sale, rental, or financing of housing. However, like so much of the policy changes that occurred after the civil rights era of the 60s, this rule is now not about preventing discrimination, but is about using civil rights language to advance the idea that government can force inter-ethnic, inter-economic, and carbon-free communities all across America. Frankly, the AFFH rule is war on the lifestyle of the single-family home and American suburban life. You might be wondering, why are bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., why would they even want to declare war on the lifestyles of Americans living in our suburbs? It is a head-scratcher for sure. You might be finding out even for the very first time that we have a federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, a department with a $50 billion budget full of well-paid bureaucrats that do nothing but come up with rules such as the AFFH. Yep, that's what it's called. What is wrong with my life, you say? I'm living in the suburbs. I'm a freedom-loving American. You might be asking yourself, why do they care? Well, nothing that HUD should be trying to fix should be of their concern. But for those who want political power and who have a worldview that doesn't believe that individuals can self-govern, everything is wrong with suburban living, and they are going to change things all around. One alleged problem this rule was supposedly trying to fix is what progressives call sprawl. They believe that it is simply not fair that one family can take up so much valuable land. And then another problem they want to fix is the environment. One family in the suburbs might own 2 vehicles, disproportionately spewing carbon during their daily commutes into the city, let alone running around their kids to soccer games. Oh, and also, it is just not fair that a family is living a nice life in the suburbs while fellow citizens with fewer resources are crowded on top of one another in low-income housing in what the left has been calling urban core. The AFFH rule pretends to take care of all of this by invading the suburban space. They want to limit single-family housing through zoning policy. They want to mandate density, low-income housing, and they want to finance all of this with tax revenues from single-family homeowners. It was a right move of the Trump administration to eliminate this inappropriate assault on the most basic American freedom, to choose where and how one wants to live. But now, presidential candidate Joe Biden, he says that as president, he will restore this rule, and restore it with even a greater force. He was a vice president when the rule was enacted, and I'm telling you, it seems that he has bought into the progressive worldview that America's suburbs are economically segregated, ethnically racist, and environmentally selfish. Thus, the federal government is needed. We gotta step up and mandate suburban housing policy to level the playing field. Yep, so I thought we should think about the differences between urban and suburban life this week on Cure America. I have some very special guests with me today to weigh in on some really critical questions, like should our suburbs be forced to adopt zoning policies that restrict the size and shape of one's single-family home? Or on the question of knowing the lifestyle differences that we have in the suburbs or in the urban communities. I happen to live in both. Is it really good policy for HUD to force low-income housing structures into our suburbs or our exurbs? What has happened in our society that far too many lawmakers believe local communities and their local governments should no longer determine the laws that govern local zoning policy? Interesting questions, causing much concern and big now political debate. So you will hear from my distinguished panel to help us sort through the noise of the news to find some truth. I'm excited to dive into this discussion with you, and we will right after this very important message.
Hello, I'm Franklin Graham. Right now, we're in Alaska unloading a hospital for COVID-19. But right now, our country is in trouble, and people are scared, people are afraid, and we see the violence and the injustices that are taking place. Only God can change this. This is a problem of the human heart, and we have sinned against God, and as a nation, we've turned our back on God. And I want you to know that God loves you, He cares for you, and He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, from heaven to this earth to take our sins. And if we'll confess them and repent, turn from them, and believe on His Son, Jesus Christ, God will forgive us and He'll heal our hearts. If you have never invited Christ into your heart, pray this prayer with me right now. Just say, God, I'm a sinner. I'm sorry, forgive me. I believe Jesus Christ is your Son. I want to trust Him as my Savior. I want to follow Him as Lord from this day forward forever. Amen. Call that number right now that's on the screen. We've got someone who will pray with you, talk with you, encourage you. God bless.
Welcome back. I told you I have a very special guest today. I mean, his column that I'm going to talk to you about had me crying, had me laughing, had me sad. In fact, I was even thinking about an old song. Remember that Roberta Flack song, strumming my face with his finger, my pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words? That's what Daniel Turner did in his column called Goodbye Washington, D.C. Daniel Turner is with me, and he is the founder and executive director of The Power to the Future. Hey, welcome.
It's so great to be here. Thank you.
That sounds like an energy work. You do working in energy? Is that what that is? Okay.
I do a lot of media, a lot of writing, but this was out of my wheelhouse, this article. But normally I deal with green issues, climate issues, energy issues, etc.
Well, it touched me, and I'm telling you, it really did remind me of that song, and it reminded
Killing Me Softly.
Killing me softly with his word. He's writing my life. I mean, look at this. If people did this to my column, I would have a syndicated column every week. If they did this to my column, I would be just so happy. But I have just totally torn this apart because you did speak your heart in this one. You said that Mayor Bowser broke her contract with the residents like me, and we're leaving, and you moved. You said during the last night in my condo in D.C., I had to walk my dog an extra lap around the block because a crazy person was outside screaming obscenities. I wasn't afraid. I just didn't feel like getting into it with him and having to listen to his story. Let me just tell you my story so that he can get some money out of me. It was 1 a.m. I was tired from a night out, but more so just tired in general. Tired of all of it. You wrote this column after the domestic terrorists came through Washington, D.C. 3 months of COVID shutdown, and now we saw our city tearing apart. And what was interesting, I think why it touched me so deeply, Daniel, is you talked about the CBS. I think we were probably neighbors. You talked about how we just want to be left alone as city dwellers, and I'm like, I may even have seen him in my elevator and just said hello as a neighbor. We must have mutual friends because your column ended up in my inbox, my personal inbox. So I want you to tell us why did you write it? Why did you leave? And then there are a few other questions that I want to ask you.
Well, first off, I'm so flattered, so thank you. Coming from you, that means a lot.
Oh, cool.
I'm a city kid. I made that clear in the article.
Yeah,
I grew up in Queens, where we've been in Queens since before the Civil War. We are longtime New Yorkers. I love D.C. I've lived here since 2002, 2003. I made it my home. And as city people, you accept a certain amount of crazy, a certain amount of unrest, a certain amount of protest. Yeah. But you also expect it to be somewhat manageable, right? And you expect to not be unsafe all the time. Right. What I saw in the last couple months crossed the line, and it's not about George Floyd, it's not about the urban unrest, it's about the fact that this one cause, and not even the cause, we all care about racial justice, but this one movement, Black Lives Matter, which for me as a conservative, It supports abortion, it supports defunding the police, it promotes Marxism. Its fundraising page goes to Act Blue, which is the DNC financial arm. This was being held up by our mayor as, this is now the vehicle we are going to support. And I said, that's not fair. Like no politician has ever made me believe in their cause before. And this one crossed the line.
Well, and that's what you mentioned. You said, you know what, you came here, as you said, from New York in 2003. You said, for the past 17 years, I've been excited to call D.C. my home. I witnessed the birth of entire neighborhoods. You're absolutely right. They transformed what used to be ghettos into entire neighborhoods. But throughout your column, you just talked about city life wanting to be left alone, that we've learned how to live with each other, so different from suburban life, just to be left alone, and how her cause became now your cause. You mentioned you did your part. You ate, you drink, you shop, you tipped, you paid your taxes. I want to hear more about that frustration that said, I'm out of here.
Yeah, I mean, that's just part of what is expected of us as good citizens, right? You follow the law. And I don't have kids, so I'm not using the school system.
Right, you mentioned that.
Yeah, I'm not taking advantage of any of the social services. And this isn't the forum to debate whether or not we should have social programs. I'm just saying these programs exist. People like me fund them. Single people like me who make a decent living and spend our money and go out to eat and go out and shop, we fund these programs. And all I want in response is just like a little bit of safety. And the constant, what's happening in the city is devastating.
Right,
and no one is calling attention to the fact that people like me are the lucky ones, the people who have mobility and can get up and go. But there are people, you know, right across the street from where I live is one of the biggest housing projects in Washington, D.C., where I used to live. I have moved since. I would see those little old ladies who kind of reminded me of my grandmother, right? It's too hot, but they're wearing a trench coat and they got their hair in a little kerchief, like, you know, their shopping cart. That CVS was where they did their grocery shopping, and that's gone. And where do they go? So there's a part of me that feels a little guilty that says, I left.
Well, but you know, and that's fine, because I think what you left in terms of your prints that strawman the pain is, you said, you know what, now we're told that silence equals violence. Indifference is no longer tolerated in urban America. And you pointed out how most Americans, a point that I had been making, just really, that we're cordial to each other. We just really want to be left alone. And you expressed a passion that this was an invasion now into your space to force you to believe an idea that you didn't want to believe. And as a Washingtonian, why should you be forced it? We have every kind of protest you can think about, and you mentioned that as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm so proud about being from Queens is that we have the world's record of the most diverse place in the world. Most languages, most ethnicities. So when people, as a response to this, say, like, you need to celebrate diversity, I'm like, you know, I have been celebrating diversity since the day I was born.
You mentioned that too. You said, in the city, people, we don't care. Gay, black, trans, no offense, but so what? We're city people.
And that's the great myth about the cities, is that we are the model of tolerance, right? We are each other's neighbors and friends, and even if not friends, we cohabitate in very close geographic areas. And the way we respect one another is giving each other space. So you're that, okay, do it. Just don't invade me.
Just don't invade me. And you're pointing out now, Daniel, that the mayor here in Washington, D.C. invaded your space. And I can appreciate it. I work here, so I keep an apartment here, but I live in the suburbs. And so now my concern is, as we're seeing more people like you leave the cities to go to the suburbs, and then the changes that are being made in policy to say, in the suburbs, especially from progressives, we're going to now force you to live like urban. What are you thinking about some of this?
Yeah, it's a real scary prospect to think that we're going to federalize housing policies, which should be the most local possible, not at the state level, but even local or at the county level. And I don't want anyone from Washington, D.C., a Republican president, a Democrat president, a progressive, a conservative, I don't want anyone dictating to states and local jurisdictions what their policies have to be on housing. Right? We need freedom to be ourselves. And when government gets involved, look at what a government does in every other program, education, etc. Do we want them in housing?
No, they're in housing. The president changed the rule, and now others said that they're going to put it back. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much. I'm just excited about my guests and the panel coming up right after these messages.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell, inventor of MyPillow. Thanks to your support, you've helped make MyPillow become one of the fastest growing companies in America. Over the last 12 years, you've helped MyPillow create thousands of jobs right here in the USA.
When I got MyPillow, I'm asleep almost immediately. I stay asleep at night, and I wake up more well-rested in the morning.
That's why I invented My Pillow. My patented fill adjusts to your exact individual needs and helps keep your neck supported and aligned. I'm interrupting this commercial right now to give you deep discounts, not just on my pillows, but also my mattress toppers, sheets, and so much more. For example, you can get body pillows regularly $89.99, only $29.99 with your promo code. With our 60-day money-back guarantee, you have nothing to lose. Sleep well, America!
For the best night's sleep in the whole wide world, visit mypillow.com.
Well, welcome back. Wow, we have a lot to talk about, and this particular issue of housing policy is escalated because the president has weighed in, Ben Carson has weighed in. They're writing op-eds now in the Wall Street Journal about how they will protect American suburbs. We've got people saying your suburbs or your roads, Biden will do in one or the other. It's interesting what's happened now, not just because of the politics, but because of the overreach of government. So today I'm going to have my panel smaller, my regulars. You know them very well. I'm going to have my rational, Dr. Henry Olsen. He doesn't want me calling him doctor, but he is senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's opinion columnist for the Washington Post. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Ethics and Public Policy Center because that's where I'm going to pull more from him today. Instead of getting him into debate about various issues, we have to get into discussions about housing policy. We really are starting to see the ideas that have failed in urban come into suburban. The Ethics and Public Policy Center was founded in 1976. It's a premier institute here in Washington, D.C., dedicated to applying the Judeo-Christian moral tradition to critical issues in public policy. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Being much more professional with you because I want your expert mind now. And as I told you last week, Henry actually writes for the Washington Post every single week. He's one of the only center-right voices in there, might be the only center-right voice in there. And so he's writing on very, very current issues in the headlines. So you might want to read that if you're trying to sort through some of the news here in Washington as we're moving into the election season. I also have my rebel. They're both my rebel panel, but I do have rational, and then I have, shall I just call it?
Erudite.
Oh, Dr. Allen?
Yeah.
I would think more radical than that. An extreme. Dr. William Allen is the Chief Operating Officer for the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. This particular organization was founded in 1995, and here in Washington, D.C. is a premier institute dedicated to fighting poverty and restoring dignity through messages of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility in public policy. And I'm giving a full introduction, and thank you, Dr. Allen,
very much.
because of this work in public policy, because we're going to talk to you today about a public policy problem, as you've already heard in the introduction, and I want to keep your attention. You know, sometimes the work in Washington, the work of Washington, or the work that they think they're doing in Washington, it seems boring to the people who elect these officials, and then you find out that they might not be such a good idea. So I want to get into this a little bit with you guys, and so thank you both. That the president now is writing a column with Dr. Carson, and they start the column that the crime and chaos in Democrat-run cities have gotten so bad that liberals are even moving out of Manhattan's Upper West Side. Rather than rethink their destructive policies, the left wants to make sure that there is no escape. So they have plans to remake the suburbs in their image so they resemble the dysfunctional cities they now govern. As usual, anyone who dares to tell the truth about what the left is doing is smeared as a racist. Then they say they're not going to let this happen. Dr. Allen, maybe I'll let you set it up for us. What is happening? Why are they having to write in the Wall Street Journal to protect the suburbs?
Well, I'm glad to set it up because I want to dig more deeply into it. I think the president and the secretary are writing this way because, of course, they've come under attack from the moment the president said we were going to get rid of the Obama-era rule, furthering fair housing by intensifying high density in the suburbs. They have had to defend themselves. And they've begun their defense by pointing out the difficulties in the urban areas in the cities. And I think they're missing the point. Because what the policy of the Obama era did, and what Biden promises to do, will do, is further the expulsion of low-income people from the cities, so that the cities will remain the preserves of those who like to go to operas and eat out. And they will not indeed be solving the problems of the environment, as they say, because they won't use cars, because they're going to have to transport those people back to serve that elite class still living in the cities. So this is an extraordinary proposal that they've made. They're going to override local zoning authority. They're going to nationalize housing policy, all to create enclaves in urban areas that are reserved for the gentrified.
Well, now that is a unique perspective, because I think also some concern, Henry, is that there's a culture in the suburbs that will be rooted, if you will, and or displaced if we start seeing the pressure to move people out of single-family homes and into dense areas and high-rise apartments mixed with low-income living. Are you at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in agreement with your colleague wrote into this too, that we should be concerned about this management from the feds? This is not local government. This is the federal department of HUD saying, we don't like the way that you live, so we're going to change things.
I think we should definitely be concerned about the federal government trying to dictate ways of life to people throughout the country, whether it's an attempt to dictate your religious mores or your personal beliefs or how many bedrooms you have or anything. I do think it's important to recognize that zoning is itself an attempt to impose a government planning dictate, that you can't have single-family zoning without it saying you can do this but not this on this piece of land, and you must do this or not. And we didn't have zoning in this country until the early part of the 20th century. So to say that this is a broad brush defense of freedom is really a bit misplaced, because one of the side effects of this type of zoning is if what Dr. Allen is saying is that this is an attempt to kick out low income.
To make them
so this is kind of like a catapult throwing the low income people out. In a sense, what single family zoning has effectively done in many cases is build a moat and a wall to keep low-income people out, because it's disturbing the free flow of people based on market incentives. So while they should not be doing this, of saying you should live this particular way, neither should local people be saying the same things to their citizens, saying you can't build a high-income development, and you can't have mixed urban work and live developments because we want to have the character of the community. That has a barrier also to the advancement of people to rise from low income to working class to middle income.
Okay. I guess my question there would be, okay, I want to go back because I think I got a little lost in when you described the America before zoning, before we even had zoning laws, because people were just free to choose, to own property, to buy property. There were instances to where certain people populations, like African Americans, were having trouble getting property. But generally speaking, you didn't see a whole lot of government to determine, as you just pointed out, we're going to map out certain communities. I don't know that I disagree with having communities say, let's not be overrun by high-rise living. I know that in where I actually reside, we have zoning laws that do not allow you to build higher than whatever that rule is to block your neighbor's ocean view. So you have a whole lot of that going on. So I want you to visit the moment in why did the policies change in the first time in the 20s to then where we moved to the 60s to have the federal government get involved to even develop out HUD so that we would then have these fair housing policies?
Well, there's a number of things that get combined here, but the first zoning policies were enacted by cities that were trying to, preserve the character of their neighborhoods, but primarily against immigrants. That immigrants would tend to be unable to afford the sort of spacious living that a city had, and so the city of Euclid in Ohio, which is the cities where zoning was declared constitutional in a Supreme Court case, was explicitly creating a zoning so that you could not have more than X number of people living in a particular community, which was a way to de facto zone out, at that time, Eastern European or Southern European immigrants. And then you combined that with the planning tendencies that were growing up in thought, so that you have one, which is a pure exclusionary, anti-poor, anti-working class motive that combined with a separate desire on the progressive movement to plan the society. And these two have merged over time, so there's kind of a de facto alliance. The planners get their way as long as the exclusionists get their way, and the people who lose out are the people who need to move up.
I think I got lost in that there was an insidious motive behind, and perhaps still is, people wanting communities to reflect their values. I don't know that I want to, unless there's some proof that I'm missing, to say that that is going to exclude now. Because what we're seeing in this discussion, that all of a sudden you're going to exclude poor people or you're going to exclude minorities. I mean, they're saying that these policies are, if you don't allow us to change the culture of your community, then you're deliberately, excluding minorities. And yet we look at the numbers of these minorities, that there are more African Americans live in the suburbs than live in a city. More Latinos live in suburbs than live in cities. So, Dr. Allen, I guess my question to you would be is that, if Henry is exactly right, that the reason that we have any type of zoning policy at all is because there was just insidiousness, that we're not going to let certain people come into certain communities, and this is the only way we can keep them out. Is that the reality today, that the city, mostly the suburbs, they're not after the rule. People seem not to be after the rule yet, that the suburbs should acquiesce to say no more building of single-family homes, that we must all love and appreciate these high-rises?
Well, some jurisdictions have already done that.
I know. In fact, they passed a law up in, even, I think the whole state of Minnesota.
Minnesota has done it, and a few other places as well. But Henry Olsen is quite right. In 1924, when the Immigration Act was passed, it was the first time a principle of exclusion was built into the Immigration Act. And that has given us the entire framework of immigration ever since that time, in which exclusion is on the table every time immigration comes up.
So this was a federal policy?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead.
Whom do you let in, whom do you not let in?
Okay.
Well, that happened to dovetail with the neo-progressives of the same era, who were doing the planning that was described, except their planning not only tied up with the exclusionists, but it tied up with those people who wanted to create what they considered an ideal of society. So it was there trying to draw a blueprint for everyone from on high that really informed those kinds of practices as they disseminated through the states and localities. So you get local zoning, primarily from people participating in a national movement of progressive redesign of society.
Wow.
That's where it came from.
That were actually started, it sounds like, by people who had really bad will, because I wouldn't want to put that on the whole of the country, that we want to be exclusive, but rather than just, I mean, most people, they just kind of live there. They've been living there for generations, and then they try to buy a bigger house in the same neighborhood where they've lived, or they've passed, or they've passed, their family properties. I know, like, all of the acres and acres upon acres and acres that we own in South Carolina as a family, it was because of passing property. And it has very little zoning law there. But this is really fascinating. I don't want you to miss your point, but I'm just wondering if a whole group of Americans just got caught up in what I'm hearing is what we still see, left and right, managing other people's lives.
Well, housing used to be much more diverse before zoning routines came into play.
Before the 20s,
I
would see that.
You go into cities all across the country and you'd see a hopscotch pattern of the well-to-do and the not well-to-do, really relatively in close proximity with one another. This was even true throughout the segregated South, believe it or not.
Sure, it was.
Where blacks and whites lived much more closely together.
Right,
in
well,
terms
like
of
where our
physical
property
proximity.
is. That's exactly right. I mean, there's just there were no lines, so everybody just kind of, they were all poor, but they were all farmers, and so they just kind of helped out each other. So you're saying then by the 20s, we started seeing federal hand and two separate groups, kind of like the special interests we have now, coming and getting involved in determining where you're going to live. This is interesting, and now today it's got even more layers. So we're going to be back in a moment with my two panelists. I just really want us to get into this because it's hurting us all now. Back in a moment.
It's time for a cure. CURE is a coalition of new voices with new ideas that will become new policies. We are the CURE. The Center for Urban Renewal and Education, headquartered in Washington, D.C., CURE works with churches, political, and business leaders on behalf of urban communities. CURE's mission is to address issues of culture, race, and poverty from a Judeo-Christian perspective. CURE. Join with us. Under the new administration, there has never been a better time to help Black communities.
Welcome back. Okay, I'm hoping that you're following a lot of this discussion because it sounds like we've had a problem for a really long time and it's been layering and layering and layering with new zoning laws that are now in Washington, D.C., and you have entire federal departments trying to solve the problem of what the progressives call sprawl, where they believe that the suburbs are a result of people just wanting to take up too much energy from the rest of society. And so we were talking a little bit about the impact on those that might not have access there. And so Henry Olsen, who is with the Washington Post and with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, was weighing in, and then Dr. William Allen was weighing in a little bit of the history of these housing policies from the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. And Henry, during the break, you were telling me a little bit more about that history. And even though we look at those times when there was aggressive discrimination in our country, I want you to weigh in a little bit about that. But I also want you to then tell me, have we not matured enough that we don't need or do we need federal law to manage this for us? Because on the point that you made about the keeping poor out, I find that the suburbs are so much less expensive than living in the city that that it's hard for me to wrap myself around that. People of various means can't just move to the suburbs or to the rural.
Well, first of all, the thing to recognize with zoning is it started and primarily still is a local measure. It did not come as a federal impetus. It came as a local impetus with cities, and most planning is governed by cities or states. Here, the feds are trying to get into the act, and that's not appropriate, particularly when it's to try and dictate a particular outcome with respect to telling you how to live. But that gives community people a lot of power. It means that if you want to provide opportunity for people to move up, you can go to your city council, you can go to your state government, or you can go to your county planning agency and say, we need to loosen up our zoning laws to give people affordable opportunities. The reason why it's a barrier is not because of people of middle or upper middle income do find cheaper housing and exchange it for longer commutes when they have to go into a city. It's the poor people who live in substandard, decaying housing in the cities who find moving to the suburbs something they cannot afford. That what they can only afford.
No, let's get on that question. Let me stay there for a minute because we want to talk about community response. What is the barrier for them not to afford, Dr. Allen? Because if you look at the rents in the suburbs, let's just take a one-bedroom apartment in the suburb might be $800, where that same one-bedroom apartment in the heart of the ghetto would be $1,800.
Sure.
So what is that barrier? Is it just being able to move? Is this something that as a society we should say transportation is a challenge just to get them in that community? Or why are we still having a discussion from the 30s and 60s when it comes to the mobility of low-income people?
Yeah, in that sense, two things are in play, and one of them is transportation that you mentioned. They can't afford typically the transportation to move back and forth to work and home if the very poor or relocate to the suburbs.
But why do they have to do that, work in the city? Can they not work?
Because that's where the jobs are.
Okay,
and the jobs don't go with you when you move to the suburbs.
Okay.
Secondly, the supply is limited in the suburbs of that one-bedroom apartment at $80 that you're talking about.
$800. I wish $80.
$800, whatever.
But you're right. No, then there wouldn't be none if it was $80.
This isn't enough supply to accommodate the demand that would come forth for it. But let me just say one more thing about this, because it's important for you and for me. The Center for Urban Renewal and Education has embedded in it urban renewal.
Right.
Urban renewal was a planning policy from the 1950s and 60s. It came to be known at the time as Negro removal. That's how it was parodied publicly, because it turned out that urban renewal meant getting poor black people out of the cities. Well, as we can tell now, 60, 70 years later, it didn't work. Yes, more black people live in suburbs than not, but that's because they became middle class and they could afford to.
Or rural,
not because planning sent them away.
Well, okay, because if you that's true to a certain extent. But okay, so after slavery, you saw the 1 million go north into the cities, but 4 million did stay south. So you have now over 50% of African Americans that live very rural in the South, and those that have income do move into more suburban than urban because they would prefer to have quality schools. I'm just wondering now, Henry, how much of this is not ethnic or about, this insidious plan of others to keep certain ethnic minorities out, but how much of it is just about the values of the suburbs, that when you talk about the life patterns of people that's where we find those that are married and raising children?
There's always a mixture of motives, but that it's not that every zoning law is passed with malign motives, but every zoning law has effects that if you want to have a single-family development home, what you are saying is that we don't want jobs in our communities.
Well, let me ask you a question just on that. I don't want to talk about what others might be saying. What I want to ask you is, do you think that someone should be able in America to own a 20,000 square foot home?
Able to, of course.
And so you don't think that they should be told by federal government that they should not, that they no longer can build that home? Dr. Allen, I want to ask you a question. Do you think that in America that we should have policies in place that tell people that they cannot buy 1 acre of land?
Certainly not.
Okay.
Certainly not.
So let's start there. Let's get out of the 20s and the 60s and the motives of those that got us to the place that now we have major parties that are saying, there are rules that we want to put in place from a federal standpoint that will override all local zoning laws, whether you agree with those zoning laws or not. Because I guess what I have issue with what you're saying, Henry, is no one's forced to live in any kind of community, or at least they shouldn't be. But what it sounds like we're hearing from the administration that's trying to take power in Washington is they're going to determine who gets to live in certain communities and who don't. And I think that they're already doing that to the poor by building these big old structures and forcing poor people to live in subsidized low-income housing. I really think we should explore options of just freedom, just let them go live anywhere. So even Dr. Allen, when you mentioned transportation, is this why Joe Biden is trying to attach, well, then I'm going to hold your transportation money if you don't start building these low-income major structures and stop people from building 20,000 square foot homes?
Yeah, sure, but here's the irony of that plan from Biden. What it means is that you're going to have to find a way to get those people from the suburbs into the jobs in the city, and you're not going to allow them to have cars for environmental reasons. Right. You're going to bus them. So this is just the 1970s school busing returning in the form of occupational busing.
And especially in the communities that aren't even accommodated to a busing program. Yeah. And then you mentioned an earlier point about those that if they go into the city, or if they were not able to live in the suburbs, that then they're not going to be able to serve those. No, you said in the city, then they're not going to be able to serve those. And I'm just wondering, even on the question of there are not jobs in the suburbs, I just don't know that that's true. I'm in all over this country, and there are just so many jobs and so many apartments, and I'm just wondering if people are just not thought of, poor and are working low income are just not thought of as with the brain ability to just say, let me move. Something's stopping them from moving, and it's not zoning policy, and it's not that there's not enough rentals available, because signs are everywhere. So I just want to get a little bit deeper into what should we do then? What should low-income people expect on either one of these plans? Whether we say we're not going to have this rule anymore, so you're kind of on your own. We're not going to force local communities to build high-rise ghettos. And Or the opposite is, we are going to force them to build these high-rise ghettos in the middle of your property. We're going to take it from you, especially now that we have eminent domain on our side, and so what to the community? I don't know. What are we going to do?
I don't think the low-income people should accept either option as optimal, because it isn't optimal. But things like, one of the things that ties people to cities is the fact that housing vouchers or Section 8 or public housing is tied to a particular location. You should be able to, just like we talk about education vouchers should be strapped to the backs of the kids, housing subsidies should be strapped to the backs of the adults to live where they want to.
Anywhere they want to.
To go anywhere they want to. That would be the one thing that could help.
Yeah, because this is an interesting point, because I think that in allowing that to happen, you're not going to have any one community overrun to then alarm the fears of those that want to keep certain people out because they have certain prejudices about them, or for what the Democrats are seeming to want to do is to say that we just don't like the values of the suburbs. We don't think people should be able to have an independent bedroom for each of their children because you're using up all of the energy from others. So is this a good idea, Dr. Allen?
That's the main point. It is not that we shouldn't have low-income housing in the suburbs. And we have a model for that with Habitat, right? Habitat for Humanity builds essentially single-family, sometimes duplex housing, but never much more than that, and try to put it out in the suburbs often enough. So that could be done readily, but that's not what's being proposed. What's being proposed is density, low-income density in the suburbs.
Which didn't work in any city. And I kind of like the idea of voucher but you remember the book, who did the book on Visible Man and then Invisible Man? I think it was, Invisible Man, you're not seeing us, we're black and we need you to see us. And now Black Lives Matter, I guess I'm taking off on Ellison's idea. But then Gilder wrote, no, you're visible, we see you. I mean, and that's what we don't want in our communities. And this is the reason that I think that you might be onto something, Henry, to say, but if you voucherize it, it's invisible. It's one single mom just trying to make a better life for her kids. And if she can go live in a flat that's outside of her community, but in a quiet suburb where the rent is only $800 and the decent schools that she won't need that extra school voucher, we might be able to change something for the future. Would you buy into something like that?
Of course I would. Absolutely. People generally should have a maximum amount of freedom to set the course of their life.
I wonder why they didn't talk. Why didn't Dr. Carson propose that then? Why are they just manipulating around the edges on these rules instead of just saying, why don't we let people live free? What is it?
Because they misunderstand the problem. That's what we're saying at the outset. They think the problem is having deteriorating cities. That's not the problem. The problem is trying to intrude engineering and planning in the cities. If they simply got rid of that and cut people free to do what they want to do, there would be no problem in that respect.
I would think so. In fact, I've said that many a time, that if HUD would just get out of the housing business, rents would market, and then they would start going like that. Next thing you know, they fall. I mean, HUD is the reason that rents are high in our poorest communities, because they came in and decided what that price is. And the next thing you know, everything is larger above that. Well, I'm hoping that we'll be able to solve this, but what's happened now is it's election. We really do have people that are writing about the Democrats puts the suburbs and family life on the November ballot. This is your expertise and specialty area. Is it on the ballot?
It's partly on the ballot. The Democrats simultaneously are trying to appeal to upper-income, comfortable suburbanites by saying that icky man in the White House is unsophisticated and has radical change. And then on the back door, they're making deals with the left of their party to bring radical change to the way of life for people in the suburbs. If the people in the suburbs buy it in this election, what they'll find is that they'll have to continue to make choices down the road, because the far left in the country wants and has had suburbs and suburban life in their crosshairs for decades.
Yeah, they have. But you pointed out something really interesting in one of your recent columns, that you were looking at a particular area. I think it was up in Washington State.
Yeah, Washington State.
And it seems like the suburbanites and those a little bit further away from Seattle are starting to notice that we're not wanting these types of values. This is not for us.
That was mainly what I wrote about in Washington State. There's a very big recovery in Republican support for areas outside of metropolitan Seattle, and a small uptick in Republican support in suburban Seattle. And you look at that and you say, if that's happening in Seattle, in Washington, which is to the left of the country. It might be happening elsewhere too.
Yeah. Sure. Do you think it might be happening elsewhere? Because Seattle is there. I mean, they're still on fire. So.
This is a time of reaction from now through November 3rd. The only question that's going to matter is how extensive is the reaction to some of the insanities that are being proposed. That's the question of the day.
Are people seeing that it's insanity, or
they're just feeling it?
They're feeling it.
They're feeling it.
I'm hoping that they're feeling it, Dr. Allen, because I'm just seeing that. I read your article with care, Henry, because it pointed out at least a little glimpse into how the people feel that are watching closely locally what's happening in Seattle. But I'm just not sure across the country. So I'm hoping that you that are watching this have been able to glean enough to say you got to keep your eyes open. This is very serious in this coming election. I'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell, inventor of MyPillow. Thanks to your support, you've helped make MyPillow become one of the fastest growing companies in America. Over the last 12 years, you've helped MyPillow create thousands of jobs right here in the USA.
When I got MyPillow, I'm asleep almost immediately. I stay asleep at night and I wake up more well-rested in the morning.
That's why I invented MyPillow. My patented fill adjusts to your exact individual needs and helps keep your neck supported and aligned. I'm interrupting this commercial right now to give you deep discounts, not just on my pillows, but also my mattress topper, sheets, and so much more. For example, you can get body pillows regularly $89.99, only $29.99 with your promo code. With our 60-day money-back guarantee, you have nothing to lose. Sleep well, America!
For the best night's sleep in the whole wide world, visit mypillow.com.
Okay, now I need to talk to a pastor. And actually I have two pastors because Marc Little is a pastor, an attorney, a political advisor, and a regular news commentator here in Washington, D.C. on a lot of different shows. You've seen him there. But Dr. Allen is actually a pastor too. So I'm glad to reintroduce you to Dr. Allen as the Chief Operating Officer for Urban Cure. But also I want the pastor hat now because we're in the wrap up. And what came up in some of our discussion, welcome, Mark. Thank you. Thanks for being here, darling. And what came up in our discussion, and always does when we're talking about preserving or getting rid of public policy that comes out of the civil rights era, that's a part of their anti-poverty programs, part of that $900 billion that we spend annually on anti-poverty programs. Every time it brings out these accusations of racism, and it brings out both right and left discussions about, nope, none of that will work, and the poor just continue to wallow in what has been there for the last 50, 60 years. So Mark, as a pastor, in fact, you've worked in this arena because being a resident of Inglewood and even having run for mayor there and even being involved in the management or zoning issues there as you brought the Madison Square Garden, I believe, to the area and with your church, owning a lot of property in that area. We had discussions about zoning policy. I guess my first question is, do you even agree that locals should have these types of policies when sometimes they may exclude people because that policy is exclusive? All policy is.
I'll tell you, thank you for this topic. I know you spoke about the HUD policy earlier, and I have to tell you that the role of the church is what we did in Inglewood. We got engaged with local developers.
Okay.
The local government has a role to play, but that role should be to incentivize developers so that they have a desire to be in a certain community. And what we did in Inglewood is we partnered. We built hundreds of units of affordable housing, both in Los Angeles and in Inglewood, in partnership with local officials. Now, as you may know, gentrification is a huge problem that's sweeping the country, and they're moving people out and moving wealthy people in. And you've got to decide as a community and as a church whether or not that's what you want in your community. In Inglewood, the mayor decided that he didn't want affordable housing. And so he would not take the dollars that the federal government had provided in order to build the affordable housing. And so my point is that if you don't like that as a resident, then you've got to get rid of him. You've got to get rid of the council members. But I believe that
or maybe run for the council. So yeah. I'm wondering though, and I think the question of the federal dollars, I think is what I'm concerned about, because the more you see federal dollars, because they're not federal dollars, these are tax dollars.
Yes, right.
These are dollars that were taken from somebody to say, we're going to go over here and play in this field and hope it works out. And yet I don't see it working out even when we trap people in what we call affordable housing, because to me, we now look at a more concentrated poverty. Sure. So I'm wondering in what Marc just said and how they just partnered with the developers that had desired to come into the community, that he was a part of their actions, but also they incentivized. Dr. Allen, my question to you, as both a pastor and a policy thinker, is all this necessary? Do we have to go this route? Can't people just live free? Is there really something about people that have limited resources that you can't just let them do for themselves? Is there really something so wrong in corporate thinking and building that you can't just let them just go out there and build?
Well, I think there is space for collective agency, for community, for working together. So I don't want us to completely undermine that, because, of course, the very model of community is the church itself. The word ecclesia, from which we get the word church, means assembling together. Okay. And we say, let's not forsake the assembling together. That's right. So community is important. Yes. Now the question is, how should it operate? Right. And you're asking, can it operate consistently with liberty, with freedom? I say yes, of course it can. What we have to do is recognize that allowing some few to tyrannize many is always a mistake. Right. And so regulations that prevent that are good. But when you twist that and the regulations begin to tell everyone what they must do, rather than simply preventing people tyrannizing others, then you've gone too far. Right. So that's abstract. I stated abstractly because then we can individually in our communities figure out what the threats are, what the dangers are.
I think, but a question we have to go back to is, what is community? Because I see in some of this management that the HUD policy is doing is trying to define community for us, and yet there are values that are consistent with married husbands married to mothers of children and want to raise those children accordingly. So I'm just not sure that we can move to the second question, Marc, without being at the first question. What is community? Is this something that they even talk about from pulpit anymore? That there are values that you have, you want to adopt, and it's okay to live near and with people who have consistent values? Well, I think you just defined it with the question. Community is a gathering of people who are like-minded and who understand how to operate together. And it's just that simple. And I have to tell you, I certainly don't want anybody in Washington, D.C. telling me what my community in Los Angeles should look like. I think that is a bridge too far. I'm very disappointed that they're attempting to just modify this new regulation. I think it absolutely has to be terminated. Well, they did. The Trump administration did get rid of it, but the Obama's, I guess it's going to be Obama again, administration. The Biden administration is saying that they're going to not only put it back, but then start threatening that if you don't comply, you're going to lose your transportation dollars. So, Dr. Allen, are we ever going to get to the point that people are just saying, maybe we ought to rethink a whole lot of what Washington does, and maybe we should mature from the topic that kept coming up about the 20s and how there were people that of ill will pushing these zoning laws? That should we get a second chance to say, can we build healthy community without so much government? This question comes around again and again. It has for decades. Can we do it differently? Can we toggle the policy? Can we amend it? Can we change it? And my usual response is to say, let's just stop doing it. Just stop doing anything. Let's say no. Well, that's what I want to know. Yeah, that's what I want to know. If we say no, that it's okay for this particular community of people to say, we kind of want housing policy in an association so that people won't build taller than and block my ocean view and disturb my housing value. We kind of like that we have a community where we can own an acre of land. And locally, if they agree with those things, then as you said, Mark, you work with your mayor, you work with the council to develop out that particular community. Is there really something wrong with that?
Let me just say one thing quickly. We know the model for that because we find it in agricultural cooperatives.
Yes.
The people who have to engage in agriculture have to pay attention to what their neighbors are doing because it affects their crops.
Yes.
And they come to agreements together about how to limit those cross-fertilizing and other kinds of impact. That can happen culturally and religiously also.
That is interesting because that's, you know why that's so fascinating to me right now is because I was a little discouraged hearing about what happened during those 20s to start all of this management out of government to keep certain people doing certain things. And prior to that, we did have farming. We did have where neighbor just helped neighbor and were respectful and cordial to what their neighbor was doing because it affected their lives too. Is that where we're gonna go again? You're shaking your head, yeah?
Far away from that.
But we're getting back there again because this show is called Cure America. So that's what we're going to attempt to do. And you will hear from me and my final thoughts right after this important message. Thanks, guys, for being with me.
Thank you.
Today, a student in public school will pray or lead a Bible study. Today, a pastor will preach boldly the truth of the Scriptures without fear of the IRS. Today, the life of an innocent child will be saved, and a mother will experience the joy of a newborn baby. A distraught woman will find hope and choose life rather than death. Today, there is a strong voice defending God's created natural order of marriage and family. There is a defender of freedom in the courtroom and in the halls of Congress and in legislative bodies across the land. Today, all of this is possible because of the ministry of Liberty Counsel. People from all over America will find help and hope because of Liberty Counsel. The adversity they face will be turned into victory, case by case, law by law, person by person. Liberty Counsel is advancing religious freedom, the sanctity of human life, and the family through litigation, education, and public policy. And that is the mission of Liberty Counsel, to restore the culture by advancing life, liberty, and family.
Great discussion. I hope that you processed the whole lot of it. You can watch it again because although the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule added to the 1968 Fair Housing Act has been rescinded, the next administration to take up power in the Capitol will determine its future. Candidate Joe Biden has made it clear that he will reenact the rule. And he's proposing that he will not only restore it in all of its provisions, but will add additional teeth. He will deny federal funds for roads as penalty for non-compliance. We can only marvel that there are those who think federal government should get involved in local zoning decisions and that local demographics is the business of progressive HUD bureaucrats. This speaks volumes about the left-wing grab for power to force its vision on what America should look like and what Americans should have over our most basic values of freedom. Which of you actually believes that bureaucrats sitting here in Washington, D.C. should decide what is best for your family, what house you should live in? We can only marvel that after all of these years of failed government anti-poverty programs like HUD, where untold trillions were spent with no benefit to anyone other than the bureaucrats making the living off of them, that progressives still claim that these kinds of programs are a good idea. Government housing programs for the poor have been utter failures. By concentrating poverty, they have created government-controlled ghettos. If we really want to help those with inadequate resources cover the cost for decent housing, then maybe we should take the $50 billion HUD budget and provide unconditional vouchers for qualifying individuals to use for wherever they want to live in a private housing. Just choose for themselves. For those on the left who want to continue to exploit our nation's most vulnerable and our poor by trapping them in public housing projects, for them now they want to expand this exploitation into our suburbs, for political reasons of social justice and climate change, oh, you know what? We should just say no, thank you. No, no, thank you. When we hear from those in Washington talking about government policy to make things more fair, everyone should just go on alert and then say, no, thank you. Because if we really care about keeping America more equitable and helping the unfortunate, then we should work to keep America free and growing and prosperous. We should work on loving our neighbor as ourselves and doing what we can locally to help charity groups and churches that serve those that need help beyond their own abilities and resources. And we should vote for policymakers who believe that this is our work, not theirs. I'm Star Parker, and I pray to think with you again next week here on Cure America.